Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, and in keeping with my attempted trend, I'm going to do some cooking today. Wasn't sure on Friday, and I wasn't even really sure when I started producing this video, but I did actually have a little experiment with cockles. I started cooking them and then I ended up pickling them, and it's not a terribly complicated process. I'll get to it towards the end of the video. And meanwhile, I want to get onto my main topic of the day, which is talking about the terms sex and gender. And sex is a biological term and gender is a cultural term. And I want to talk about the difference between the two and why the difference got embedded into social scientific theory 100 years ago, I guess, a little bit less, and why it matters. But I also want to problematize it a little bit because it's not as clear-cut as you might think. Like, the simple idea is that a person's sex really indicates, if you like, at base their sex chromosomes. If you have two X chromosomes, then you produce female biological characteristics, and if you have one X and one Y chromosome, you exhibit male physical characteristics. And that's supposedly it, but gender has more to do with what it means to be masculine or feminine, which are gender terms from linguistics. And in some ways, the difference between biological sex and cultural aspects of gender are, let me say, simple and complicated. So let's get down that path. So, biological sex is certainly something that's been debated for a long time in terms of how it affects you physically and what it means for your behavior. That is, leaving aside some of the complications about chromosomes, and there are certain anomalies that occur in all animals that have what they call sexual dimorphism. That is a physical difference between the male of the species and the female of the species. And in humans, of course, males have certain both primary and secondary sexual characteristics. Like, the primary characteristic of a male human is that he has a penis, and that's the primary characteristic. And the secondary characteristics which develop at puberty are things like facial hair, and may also include a certain distribution of fat in the body, increased musculature, and so forth. Those are sexual characteristics. And for a long time, people used to say biology is destiny. That is, if you have male primary and secondary sexual characteristics, you will develop male or masculine characteristics, like being aggressive, competitive, dominant, whereas if you have female sexual characteristics, you will develop into a caring, nurturing, kind of person. And this was not particularly debated until the beginning of the 20th century, and one of the prime movers in this was Margaret Mead, who produced a work in 1935 called Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. And she tried to show that the behavioral characteristics of men and women were not fixed, that the sexual characteristics are pretty much fixed. I mean, if we just leave some of the anomalies aside, that the sexual characteristics are more or less immutable, but that the behavioral characteristics can change depending on the society, the culture that you grew up in. And she showed that there are societies in which women are more dominant, more aggressive than men. There's societies where both men and women are behaviorally approximately equal, and so forth. Well, her study was not very good, and studies done later by anthropologists showed that she had skewed her data considerably, and that her conclusions were not really sound. But it had opened up the question of whether your biology leads deliberately to a particular way of behaving, or whether it was learned through social conditioning, in socialization and culturalization. Well, it's complicated, but let's talk about gender a little bit. Now, gender is a term that comes primarily from linguistics, and if you have ever studied French or German or Italian, Latin maybe, Portuguese, you'll know about gender. That gender can be a way to divide up the nouns in a language. And in most of the Romance languages, like French, and Italian, and Spanish, there are two genders, masculine and feminine. In German, there are three, following Latin. There's masculine, there's feminine, and then there's neuter. And I suppose you could, in theory, say that English has three genders also, masculine, feminine, and neuter, except that masculine and feminine are only used for living things that are sexually divided into male and female. So that for horses you can divide them into stallions, which are male or masculine, I guess, and mares that are female or feminine, and take pretty much all the animals and you find an English term for the male of the species and the female of the species, ram and ewe, a boar and sow, and so on. And all of the nouns that are not associated with sexual distinctions in English are neuter. That is, they don't have a gender. Whereas in Spanish and French, you have to learn the gender of different nouns when you learn the language, because you need to know the gender both for the definite article and also for agreement with adjectives. So that if you have a table, for example. Table in Spanish is feminine, la mesa. And if you're going to then describe it using an adjective, the adjective has to agree in gender with the noun. And this is one of those huge problems that English speakers have when they're learning French and Italian or whatever, because it doesn't appear to make a lot of sense. Like, why is a table or a chair feminine? Why is my hand feminine? It doesn't seem to be an ascription of maleness or femaleness. Gender seems to be independent of male and female, and that's why we use the term masculine and feminine, distinguishing genders, which can be masculine or feminine, and sex, which is male and female. So we've got two different kinds of terms for sex and gender. All right. Well, linguists do occasionally try to make the point that there is something vaguely female about nouns that are feminine. Although the studies are really pretty inconclusive. Like, for example, in Spanish, all nouns that end in dad, it's always been a joke, because they say that all dads are female, like verdad, which means truth. Most abstractions are feminine. And a case can sort of be made that there's something vaguely female about abstraction, but it's a really hard case to make. That really sex and gender in linguistics are really quite different categories, and that gender is not reliant on sex. So the way the argument goes is that just as linguistic gender is arbitrary, that something could just as easily be masculine as feminine, and a clear case is given with the example of bridge. A bridge, like a bridge over a river. In German, a bridge is feminine, and in Spanish, a bridge is masculine. The choice whether to be masculine or feminine is just historically arbitrary. Although, because they've all descended ultimately from Latin, the genders of different objects tend to coincide over different languages, but they don't have to be one or the other. So that what social scientists are arguing is that just as linguistic gender is fluid, so cultural gender is fluid as well too. So when we talk about masculine traits or feminine traits, we're not talking about things that are dependent on a person's biology, but on the training in a particular culture. And if the training is different, then the masculine and feminine traits will be different. And this is really very, very important, because if a masculine trait or a feminine trait is arbitrary and assigned by a culture, then it can be changed much more easily than your primary and secondary sexual characteristics. It's not very easy for a woman to grow a beard, for example. It does happen, but it's not very common. But by this argument, there is absolutely no reason why a person with male physical characteristics can't be loving and kind and caring, and a person with female physical characteristics can't be aggressive, competitive, and dominant. We know this. If we take the very simple example of sports, competitive sports, there are plenty of women who are active and enjoy sports that are competitive and aggressive. There are women boxers, women basketball players, women, well, not so much baseball, but softball, and so on. The so-called, what we call masculine characteristics can be exhibited by women, and plenty of men who are openly loving and caring and kind, especially to their children, in the same way that women are. So that, like, the simple argument is that sexual characteristics are fixed by our biology, and gender characteristics, or what we also call gender roles, are learned as we grow up. And this is part of this somewhat loosey-goosey idea of nature versus nurture, which is it's a hokey debate. There is no trait that is entirely nature or entirely nurture. There's a mixture of the two. Well, the thing is that gender is the same way, that gender characteristics are not entirely dependent on the way somebody is raised. Now, it's certainly true that if you have a son, you may think that you need to raise that son in a certain way, have certain toys, versus what you would give a daughter. And classic example is that you give a young boy a gun or trucks, or maybe G.I. Joe, whereas you'll give a girl dolls and various accoutrements to go with that, like a baby pram and whatnot, and maybe give her a toy oven and cookware, and you'll teach the girl how to clean and cook, and you teach the boy how to fight and roughhouse and play tough sports and whatnot. All true. All certainly true. And these things can be changed. When my son was growing up in the country in New York State, every single boy his age, when he went to school, he started going to school when he was 4 years old, or preschool, every single boy his age had close cropped hair, kind of like mine is now. And he decided he didn't want to have close cropped hair, he wanted to have long hair. And because he didn't like having his hair cut. He'd never had his hair cut. He's 29 years old now, and he's still never had his hair cut. And that's the way I chose to raise him, and that's the way he is. And you can characterize long hair as feminine and short hair as masculine, as the culture where we live did, but you can also break it. Paul, in his epistles, says, something ludicrous. He says that it by nature, he uses the Greek word physis, it means nature, it gives us the word physics, that by nature boys have short hair and girls have long hair? Well, it's obviously not by nature. If it was by nature, boys wouldn't be able to grow long hair. It's cultural. And that's it into it. It can be changed. But how much of our behavior can be changed, and what causes what? And one of the ways we can think about this is by looking at the male sex hormone testosterone. Studies have shown that men, and they partly used prisoners for this, that highly aggressive, highly dominant, like criminally aggressive men have demonstrably higher levels of testosterone than men who are more nurturing and kind and caring. And it's well documented that single men have higher testosterone levels than fathers, that is, fathers who are actually caring for young children. Now, what's cause and what's effect? Is it the higher testosterone levels in males by nature that causes them to be aggressive and domineering and competitive, and lower levels to be the opposite? Or is something else going on? You see, you can just as easily make the argument that when a man participates in a competitive, aggressive, dominant sport, his testosterone levels go up. Think about it in terms of blood pressure. Like, my blood pressure is normally fairly even and consistent, but if I do something really strenuous, if I get on my bike and I ride 30 kilometers at high speed, then my blood pressure goes up. Now, it's not correct to say that an elevated blood pressure causes me to ride my bike fast. It is much more likely to be correct to say that by riding fast, my blood pressure goes up. And the same may be true of testosterone. And indeed, the studies of testosterone are really not straightforward. They don't indicate clearly how they translate into like stereotypically masculine behaviors. So we can begin with a pretty simple issue and see how things get complicated quickly. If you look at male brains in humans and female brains for adults, you'll notice that there are some obvious differences that neurophysiologists have noted, that male brains, for example, are by and large bigger than female brains. Well, here we have the first of many problems. Size in the human brain doesn't make a great deal of difference to things like intelligence. What makes a difference is not the absolute size, but the size of particular parts of the brain. Neanderthals, for example, had bigger brains than Homo sapiens. But doesn't mean that Homo sapiens are less intelligent or whatever. I mean, the size doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters on a grand scale, but it doesn't matter on a small scale. So the fact that male brains are bigger than female brains doesn't mean that much. But male brains and female brains are actually wired differently. Well, now, is this genetic? Is it a biological fact, or is it a cultural fact? And the simple answer is we don't know, because the human brain isn't born intact. It develops over childhood, and neural networks and pathways all develop as we grow up. So is it the case that male and female neural pathways are different because they are programmed differently, that is, they are hardwired differently, or do they develop differently because the learning process of boys and girls as they mature is different because of cultural circumstances? And the fairly obvious answer is we don't really know. There's not been enough research done on this, and to a certain extent can't be done on it because it's very difficult to do detailed physiological research on newborn and young children. I mean, it's not particularly ethical. You can't go in and dissect or place electrodes internally and so forth. We just can't do it. So we don't really know. But it does seem to be the case that male and female brains are different. And my ultimate non-conclusion is that some of the differences are caused by genetic or biological differences, and some of them are caused by environmental or learning circumstances. Which gets us back to the place where I have been for a long time, which is to say that the nature versus nurture debate is not a debate, because all human behavior is a combination of genetics and learning. And the critical question is not whether it's one or the other, but how the two are related. And the simple answer at this point is that we really don't quite know. But what we do certainly know is that gender roles are malleable. Now, they can be malleable when we're adults, but they can also be malleable in our growing up. And we can start socializing boys and girls in a different way from the way that we have been used to. Here's the problem. We're starting off with a world that has fairly well-defined stereotypical notions of what it means to be feminine and what it means to be masculine. So you have a chicken and egg problem. How do adults who've already been socialized into being feminine or masculine in stereotypical terms, how do we get them to train children in a different way? And that is the million-dollar question, and one that anthropologists are still working on. And I will have more to say about this on Friday. But meanwhile, let me just briefly turn to my little experimentation with cockles, and I'll show you what I ended up with. So let's switch our attention to cockles. Now, I really enjoy making linguine with white clam sauce, and that involves making the linguine, of course, and the sauce is basically garlic and parsley and clam juice and clams. But here in Phnom Penh, I can't get clams. I can get clam juice, so I can make a kind of simulacrum. But I saw some cockles the other day in the market. Normally here in Cambodia, I'm not a big fan of bivalve shellfish, because the waters that they're taken from are pretty polluted, and of course they filter all the water through them to eat, and I don't know whether there's mercury or industrial waste or whatever in them, so I don't normally buy them. But I saw some in a market I trusted, and I thought, okay, I'll buy them, and I'll try to use cockles instead of clams to make linguine with white cockle sauce rather than clam sauce. Well, it really wasn't very good. And here is the remains of what I tried. I actually used ramen rather than linguine, and it didn't work out. So I ate the ramen, that was fine, and I put the cockles and the garlic and parsley in rice wine vinegar. And I thought, well, you know, we used to eat cockles at the seaside in England in vinegar and black pepper, so I'll try that. But then I thought, after I'd left them marinating in the vinegar for many, many days and not really paying attention, what should I do with these pickled cockles? And so I decided today to chop up some tomatoes and some peppers and mix it all together and make a little kind of cockle vinaigrette and put it on spinach leaves and lettuce leaves, and here we are. And it turned into a really nice kind of appetizer sort of thing, although as it happens I used it as my lunch. And I decided to add some cream crackers to the dish because it just needed something a little sort of blandish to take away some of the sour vinegar quality. Very nice, all the same. And so there's my recipe for the day. Take some cockles, you poach them, take them out of the shells, marinate them in a mixture of garlic, parsley, and vinegar for a day or two, and then serve them up with your favorite salad vegetables. A wonderful dish. And so Friday I will return to my discussion of gender, and meanwhile, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on Friday.